Act 4. Makari had tried, unconvincingly, to act like Gazkul's second exit from the Armageddon had been the end of the story it had to tell. But everyone in the room, and Brother Hendrickson in particular, had been adamant that it was not. And so they had continued for a while, dealing with Yarick's pursuit, the Battle of the Haunted Gulf, and Gazkul's purloining of an entire space armada from the warlord Urgok. It was just fight after fight after fight, told with tireless relish by that cackling wretch and its throne-forsaken interpreter. By the time they had endured 6 hours of the Octarian War, however, in which Gazkul had defeated a seemingly never-ending sequence of ever-larger tyrannid beasts in single combat, Folks had been flagging. The interrogation had been going on for its 22nd straight hour without a break by then, and as they hadn't paused the questioning since Zottel's death, and in the end it had taken a stern mental prod from Cassia for Folks to even admit to herself that she was fatigued. She'd tried to point out to the Ogryn that Hendrickson had been on his feet just as long as she had, but that had only earned her a tight-lipped look of scepticism in reply. Cassia had not needed the nuance of psychic communication to point out how ridiculous a standard that had been to set for herself. The psyker had vacated her head and abruptly asked for a 6-hour adjournment to the session out loud. Folks had permitted it, and though she had left the cell irritated with the fact she needed rest at all, she had been satisfied at least that she hadn't been the one to call for it. And now she was here, in the stale-smelling, slightly too humid space that passed for her quarters. The captain's cabin on the Exactor was palatial, but the Lord Inquisitor had long ago vacated it in favour of this cubbyhole, repurposing her original suite as an armoury. She had tried to convince herself the decision had been made out of Spartan humility, and maybe, for her younger self, it might have been. But no matter how many rejuve treatments you had access to, you didn't get your 14th decade without appreciating the worth of a good bed, and Folks missed that gold-braided monstrosity every time she woke up with a new click in her spine. No. The miserable truth was, Folks had abandoned the captain's cabin as she just couldn't sleep in that bigger room, with that many shadows. Glancing at the servo skull hovering patiently beyond the bed's drapes, whose ocular readout she had set to display the shipboard time, Folks groaned in irritation. 4 hours had passed, and it barely seemed worth trying to sleep any more. She was just debating whether to call the interrogation back to session early, when there was a thump on the door. "Come in, Brother Hendrickson," she sighed, as Cassia slept like a professional, and nobody else on the crew would know her well enough to be so assured that she had no rest to be disturbed. "Leave the light off," she said, waving a hand from the bed as his enormous form lumbered into her peripheral vision. "You couldn't sleep either, or didn't you want to?" "Could have done, actually," said the Fenrisian dolefully. "But I wanted to eat more. Skipped a lot of meals listening to that damned Grönerson." The old psyker sat heavily on the battered armchair across the chamber from the bed, and Folks heard, rather than saw, the cold roast synth bird he'd brought with him as a palate cleanser. "And while you ate," asked Folks, "did you wonder the same thing as me? Namely, why Makari would so willingly betray its beloved prophet, now that we know that they were so touchingly reunited upon his departure from Armageddon?" "Don't think it's betraying him at all," said Hendrickson plainly, as he chewed. "I think it's a trick. They're trying to play us." "That was your reasoning for doubting Makari's identity too," she pointed out, but that turned out to be real enough. Brother Hendrickson shrugged in the dark. I still think it's all a deception, Lord Inquisitor. You're the one with a tendency to change your opinions to suit the facts after all. You want to watch that. The Space Marine took another great, cracking chomp and talked through a mouthful of meat. Can be dangerous, you know. Fawkes half laughed and let the silence settle on the dingy cabin for a while like the worn comfort of an old trench blanket. So go on then, she said at last. What's their scheme, do you think? No idea, answered Hendrickson, with the casual air of someone who'd long ago grown unconcerned by the scheming of aliens. But whatever it is will catch them out before they spring it, or just after. Either way, this isn't the day the monsters get one over on us, Titanida. All will be well. All will be well, sighed Fawkes, who had lived her entire life convinced of the opposite. You say that every damn time, and you really believe it, don't you? Is this optimism a personal thing, or did the Emperor make your kind with faith built in? Faith, barked Hendrickson, waving a half-stripped bone in mock scorn. Faith is thinking other people will solve your problems. Faith isn't for the likes of you and I, folks. We are those other people. We solve the problems. The Fenrisian crunched down on the bone and swallowed the shards before speaking again, but this time there was real scorn in his voice. And the Emperor might be our father, but he is not our maker. And Astartes makes himself. Oh, with a little help from the gene seed, added the Inquisitor dryly, and Hendrickson leaned forward, temper roused. The spirit of the wolf is earned, folks. It is not some random boon. It is a curse, as you well know, carried by those of us with the will to surpass our humanity, but it is a blessing too. It gives me what you called my optimism. I know all will be well, because whatever ill comes to pass, I know I will be capable of making it well, or I shall die well in trying so. There is nothing to be concerned about. Fawkes was still combing her mind for the words to express just how spectacularly incomprehensible that sort of confidence was, when the silence was split by the drawn shriek of a siren in the concourse outside. An instant later, the chamber was plunged into the angry red gloom of the Exactor's emergency lighting system. Containment breach. The words slunk into Fawkes's mind like ice water, even before the warnings had appeared on her data viz. Hendrickson was already on his feet, knife drawn, with his eyes flicking grimly over the invisible text of his own ocular readout. Moments ago, a maintenance servitor had found the brig door open, with a full squad of Fawkes's private guard dead around it, and now, even as Fawkes scrambled into her shipcoat and snatched up her pistol belt, a new alert was pulsing in the ship's dorsal barrack deck. A cabin had been breached. "Cassia!" gasped Hendrickson, just as Fawkes pinpointed the source of the second alert herself, and he sprinted for the door. Fawkes followed, and while she thought about reminding Hendrickson of his assertion that all would be well, she soon decided it would be better to save her breath for running. Cassia had not had a clean death. Just as was the case with an orc, you just couldn't kill an ogren cleanly. At least if all you had was a knife. And going by the awful landscape of gouges, slashes and punctures that had been carved into her mountain of a body, it had certainly been a knife. By the looks of it, The struggle had started at her desk while she had been at work on her journal. The Imperial Truth held that Ogryns could not write, of course, but over the last 2 years, through repeated study of old Ordo-Biologus texts borrowed from Fawkes's personal library, she had been teaching herself. Cassia had developed a fine hand for calligraphy of late, but now her journal, like everything else in the room, was coated in thick, congealing blood. The truth, Fawkes supposed, had been restored.
"Biter!"
growled Hendrickson from where he squatted on his haunches beside the psyker's body.
"The servitor," replied Fawkes. "Bjorn's clawswoman, what do you speak of?"
"The servitor that brought Zottel's tank in. After Biter went to help it clamp the wheels, they put their hands on it. They must have snatched the clearance stud from it and kept hold of it till we were gone."
"Impossible," growled Hendrickson. "Those things are bolted on. No orc is that fast."
"This one was," retorted Fawkes, and looked back at the wreckage surrounding the body of the woman who might one day have become her acolyte. Cassia had fallen in a tangle of smashed furniture, and from the patches of dark orc blood mixed in with the lake of her own and the stink of ozone in the air, it seems she had put up a good fight on all fronts. But looking at the deep puncture wound in the side of her neck, the first inflicted, Fawkes presumed, and deep enough to open her cable-thick carotid artery, she had not stood a chance.
"Well fought, girl,"
whispered Hendrickson as his eyes, widening with wrath, flicked to the trail of a black blood leading to the cabin's secondary entrance. It led to the barracks mess area, and beyond that lay the Exactor's dorsal transitway. "They'll be headed to the aft-escaped pod cluster," said Fawkes, as she registered the slashed canvas where the access device had been cut from the wrist of Cassia's shipcoat. Hendrickson was already gone when she turned, pounding across the barracks with the scent of orc blood in his augmented nostrils. But even the old wolf was not a fast enough hunter for this quarry. As he saw the same new dataviz alert as Fawkes of an unplanned pod jettison from the aft cluster, he stopped in his tracks, muttering a Fenrisian curse. As they were still making transit through the warp, there was no point trying to shoot the pod down. It would have tumbled back into real space the moment it left the Exactor's Gellerfield. The orc had escaped. Brother Hendrickson should have howled in frustration, or torn a steel table from its mountings, or manifested his fury as a storm of unfocused psychic energy. But he did none of those things. Instead, the shaman took a long, steadying breath, shook his head as if to clear it, and pulled out the last of the synth bird. It was Fawkes, then, who lost her temper.
"Pox, you rotten rune priest! How can you be so callous as to eat at a time like this? She's dead, Hendrickson. Dead. Does that mean nothing to you beside your damned appetite?"
Hendrickson swallowed, wiped his hands on his thighs, and then began to walk slowly towards her. After the messy confrontation that had forged their bond all those years ago, Fawkes had always thought twice before speaking to the wolf in anger. And now, as his eyes locked on hers, shining with a deathly cold stillness, she remembered why.
"Never presume what I do or do not feel,"
he warned, in a voice soft as a predator's steps in snow.
"I will mourn, but before that there will likely be violence. My body is large, it must be fueled. This is not some merry feast, Lord Fawkes. This is me maintaining my capacity to kill."
Fawkes swallowed hard. and pressed her heels against the steel of the deck to will herself against stepping backwards from the psyker. "Of course, Brother Hendrickson," she said, nailing down her temper. "I misspoke."
"Forgiven,"
said the Space Marine, but the ice did not leave his eyes.
"Now, the grot. Unless our escapee has also found time to tinker with our monitoring systems, the creature remains in its cell."
"You intend to kill it?" asked Fawkes, wanting nothing more now.
"No. I intend for us to finish interrogating it. This is a vessel of the Ordo Xenos Inquisitor. Let us do what we do best."
Although the cell had been left open, the prisoners' restraints had been cut. They arrived to find the grot sitting cross-legged at the foot of the interrogation chair, and despite its shattered arm, its smashed nose, and the great gouge where its flesh had been cut away for the cupbearer, it was grinning. It did not look afraid to die. If anything, Fawkes thought, it seemed faintly crestfallen as Hendrickson did not move to strike it, but entered the room with no regard to the creature and set down the heavy roll of fur he had fetched from his quarters. "I hate to ask the obvious," ventured Fawkes, as Hendrickson untied the thong securing the bundle and unrolled it on the cell's floor. "But how are we going to interrogate the thing if it doesn't know a word of Gothic?"
"There are older ways,"
said the rune priest simply, and began to strip out of his shipboard overalls. Seeing the collection of items laid out on the unrolled fur, Fawkes began to realize what the shaman had in mind. There were bundled herbs, pitch-blackened animal skulls, and horn vessels stoppered with plugs of crude wax. There were runes formed from the twine-fastened bones of infants and strips of desiccated, evil-looking meat. And, at the centre of it all, glistened the long, cruel sharpness of a kraken's tooth. "He really does mean old ways," she thought. And, despite herself, the fascination for all things alien which had led her into this disaster of a life flared anew. The paraphernalia on the pelt had nothing to do with the Emperor's light. These were things from the long darkness of the Fenrisian winter, unguents that had glistened in firelit caves long before the master of mankind had ever come to bring his hunters back to heal. But they had never been forgotten. And for all that Hendrickson had espoused the discipline and doctrine of sanctioned imperial psychers, he had been trying to set a good example for Cassia. She only realized now. He had always kept these eerie relics to hand. The Space Marine was fully naked now, and his body was terrible to look upon. Fawkes had never been particularly interested in male bodies, but even if she had been, she would have found little to relish in Hendrickson's. It was masculinity amplified into nothing but a weapon, something constructed with all the accidental grace of nature stripped away and replaced with the monolithic brutalism of an armoured vehicle. As Hendrickson grabbed a pot of some reeking oil and began smearing it over a torso pocked with scars, scalpel seams, stretch marks, and the angry welts of embedded socket ports, Fawkes found sudden insight into why the Astra Militarum's main battle tank had been dubbed the Lehman Russ. Hendrickson's tattoos, she saw now, had been inked when he had still been human. They were warped now, stretched over the places where bones had been rebuilt and where hillocks of muscle had been forced to grow. In their contortion, you could almost see the ghost of the boy he had once been. stretched out over the frame of a monster, and Folks felt a moment of pity for Hendrickson as he traced over their lines with a fingertip dripping with rancid tallow. When his body was prepared, Hendrickson took up the Kraken's tooth, whispered what was either a prayer or a curse, and began dragging its point across his chest, thighs, forehead and shoulders, with nothing but coldness in his eyes. The wicked fang was guided by ancient ridges of scar tissue where it had bitten the rune priest in years long past, and blood sprang hungrily from the reopened wounds, repulsed by the grease the shaman had applied to his runic markings. The flow parted around the tattoos, so they continued to shine as blue as his eyes did through the dark red sheen of gore. Clothed now in nothing but his own blood and his ancestors' words of power, Hendrickson walked forwards in a trail of sopping red footprints, beard dripping as he approached the prisoner. Makari was not grinning any more.
Gazkul left Armageddon,
he stated, as he crouched down and squatted until his eyes were level with the creature's.
He built up his forces in preparation for a broader war, and for a long time he evaded pursuit. But not forever. He was hunted down, Grot, wasn't he? By Ragnar.
As the bloodied apparition said the name of his former chapter master, Makari's eyes widened in recognition and in hatred. The creature hissed between wet, blackened teeth.
You saw the fight, didn't you? Continued Hendrickson. I know you did. I see it in your Xenos eyes. I smell it on you.
Those last words emerged as a growl that made Folks's scalp pucker around the skull plate at the nape of her neck. And while she opened her mouth to speak, she could not find the words to express her unease. Hendrickson's head snapped round anyway, fixing her with those horrible, expressionless eyes in their mask of cruor.
Cassia always held that a picture spoke 1,000 words, did she not? Said the shaman. So, I shall do this thing to honor her. We have heard enough of this wretch's words. Let us see what is in its mind directly at last.
Turning the blood-matted, shaggy immensity of his head back to Makari, the rune priest reached forward with a dripping arm, and in a motion too fast for the Gretchen to react to, clamped his hand around the beast's skull.
Vishmek Krongar,
he commanded, in some archaic version of his native tongue. His voice was wind-whipping through bare black branches. It was the creaking grind of sea ice, tightening around the timbers of a ship. It was a blizzard, and Folks became lost in it.
Chapter 10. Gazkul's even bigger fight. Masonry shatters with the impact of bolt shells. The air is thick with smoke. Above, the shell of a great cathedral has been cracked, beneath a sky ripped through with war. It is either night or day made dark by fire, and the bruised black storm clouds are raked by the bright talons of fire. You do not know if they are the wreckage of the mighty ships which trade blows beyond the veil, or more drop pods marked with the head of the wolf. Below there are bodies. You crawl among them, as your taloned hands scrabble over the flagstones, groping a way forward through the black breath of war. They encounter flesh and sundered armor. There are the bodies of my brothers, with limbs sheared cruelly, cleaved by wicked blades. There are the bodies of your masters, riven by chain and shell. Here, now, is the slack jaw of a great orc warrior. You use his tusks as footholds, as you scramble over his legless torso and then dive back among the dead as gunfire rattles and shells sing above your head. Quivering in terror, you reach desperately over the corpse and pull your bullet-riddled banner over to join you. There is a deep rumble, and the floor shakes. Ahead of you, a column of stone sags and begins to fall slowly sideways. It falls like the fist of one of your brutish gods, raising plumes of fire and dust. It is only an aftershock, you know, of the blast which felled the ribs of the roof. Beset from all sides, your prophet detonated a great store of munitions hidden in the walls, so as to cut both himself and his opponent off from the support of their warriors. He knows he must fight this combat alone, because he has had a vision. You were there. It was his greatest vision yet, and his most violent, seizing his body as if the gods themselves had him in their jaws. He came round from it, knowing that this fight was destined, that it was the narrowing he had to pass through in order to bring about the flourishing of your great green. But the falling roof has cut you off from your master just as thoroughly. You had been following close behind him when an explosion sent you sprawling. A grenade, you realized, as shrapnel lanced into your flesh. And behind its shockwave came my brothers, throats alight with the war cries of the ancient mountains. You ran from their advance, scurrying back to cower in the smoke. Ever since, you've been crawling among the bodies, trying to find a route back to your prophet through the labyrinth of carnage. Until now, every wretched advance has met a dead end, forcing you to backtrack, and you have grown ever more anxious at the bellows of the prophet, as they have rolled out from the duel at the center of the great structure. But now, you have a way to rejoin him. The falling column has crushed orcs and the sons of Russ alike, and for now at least, the way ahead of you is clear. Shrieking the blasphemy you might call a prayer, you raise the banner in your spindly limbs, and you charge across the waste of smashed stone. Slap, click, slap, click, slap, click. Your unshod taloned feet smack against the masonry as you sprint through the ruins towards the dirge of the prophet's roars. You do not know what aid you plan to offer him, only that you must be by his side, by the will of your gods. So you push through the smoke that hovers like the terror in your head, and you run on. You hop over the limbs that poke from the rubble. You cringe crouch as more debris smashes down to either side of your path. But neither stone nor bullet finds your flesh, and soon you reach the wall of rubble that has made an arena of the shattered cathedral's heart. Greenness sings in your veins as you notice a gap in the wall. The hand of a saint is propping up a stone the size of a mastodon or a squigoth, you think, leaving a gap too narrow for either orc or man, but wide enough for one such as you. The banner will not fit, so you leave it behind and scramble into the crack on your elbows. Your master's rage booms from up ahead, near deafening you in the confines of the crevice, and shards of stone carve deep gashes in your limbs in your haste to reach him. The walls crush ever closer, but all their weight seems as nothing beside the narrowing window of your destiny. You reach the end of the passage, and your chest clenches around a breath. Framed by the jagged outline of the stone blocks at the barrier's edge is the beast that intends to turn the stars themselves green. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka stands on the raised dais of the cathedral's altar, towering above those statues which still stand in the desolation around him. And as a void ship's death high above casts a mantle of green plasma light over his colossal form, he throws his head back and roars in holy triumph. But there is a second giant, pacing in a wide circle beyond the reach of your lord and master. It is Ragnar Blackmane, and he wields the relic Frostfang with the skill of centuries. Although you do not know that, you merely note that he is waving a chainsaw of unparalleled size. As the Wolf Lord stalks his quarry, so you see ripples spread from his boots, and you fear it to be your master's blood, but then you see the hydraulic feeds of his armor have been slashed, one by one, and have made a foul lake of the dais. This is scant comfort to you, however. You are reminded of the prophet's slaying of the warlord Dregmek long ago, in which the larger orc had been made vulnerable by the slow crippling of his armor. The towering battle harness worn by your lord is more like a building than it is like armor. It is of a mass beyond your imagining, and now you dread that Dregmek's fate will be returned upon his executioner. But Gazkull is not Dregmek. The prophet curls his lips back from fangs as long as your arms, and in a voice as thick and black as the spilled hydraulic fluid at his feet, he taunts Blackmane in the tongue of men. "Finish this!" It is a command for an ending, but the orc who speaks for the gods sounds more as if he is impatient for something to begin. Either way, the Wolf Lord obliges. Thinking his foe hobbled, he sprints up the steps at the dais' edge, boosts himself from the shorn stone of a martyr's statue, and leaps in a soaring arc towards his foe. Gazkull lunges. That he moves at all under such a weight of steel is unfathomable, but that he moves with such speed is unthinkable. It is a miracle to you. As the tower of his body surges forward, he plants one mighty iron boot up on the altar of the Emperor himself, and he too propels himself into a leap. "Get him, boss!" you screech despicably from your hole. Ragnar's bolter erupts in a storm of point-blank fire, spraying explosive bolts into the prophet's face as they sail towards each other. But so thick is his skin, and so dense is the bone beneath, it may as well be a handful of sand. The two giants collide, and crash to the nave with a thunderous clashing of plate. There is a brief, savage struggle, and then they rise, locked in a mortal embrace. Gazkull's great, jagged cage of a claw is clamped fully around Ragnar's torso, and as you hear ceramite splinter beneath its closing, you shriek in exultation. But then you see it. Frostfang has been driven, point first, into the prophet's neck. The relic's vicious teeth have been jammed by the thickness of his hide, but already they are juddering as the motor whines to free them, and scraps of rubbery skin are beginning to be thrown free of the wound. As your cry of triumph descends into a moan of horror, you scramble to extricate yourself from the stone and run to your master's side. But the gap is too narrow. Maybe 3 Makaris ago, when you had been a runt of incredible feebleness, you might have made it through. But in this form, you are stuck fast, with your head free and one arm reaching out in futile desperation. There is a tremendous wet crack as the thumb blade of the prophet's claw punches through Ragnar's breastplate, spilling a thick curtain of the Wolf Lord's heart's blood. It is a mortal wound. But in the same instant, a great rope of snarled, twisted skin is torn free from Gazkull's wound, and Frostfang's teeth leap into a furious blur of motion. Even as you struggle in vain, the blade chews through the leg-thick tendons of your master's neck, and then, in a great spray of chipped bone and pulverized flesh, his spine is severed. With his last gasp of breath, the prophet speaks a single phrase, into the dying Ragnar's face, but you do not hear it over your own wails of despair. The head of Gaskell Thraka falls to the floor. It lands on the adamantium plate that seals his holy wound, and the shock of the impact reverberates around the whole of the cathedral. It is enough, in fact, to jog the statue's hand that props up the tunnel you are trapped in. With a heavy, muted thud, the huge stone block above you falls flat. The cathedral's nave begins to spin wildly, and you spend a few moments wondering why this is, until you realize you cannot feel your body anymore. As your head comes to rest, after rolling a short way across the nave, you blink the masonry dust from your eyes. Your vision is fading fast, but before it goes entirely, you see one last vision as you gaze involuntarily up the steps of the dais. Ragnar is standing shakily on the ruin of the prophet, with a ghastly rent in his chest. He is swaying, barely keeping his feet beneath him. In one hand, he holds aloft the head of Gaskell Thraka, and before the green rises up from the black to take you, you see that your master's tusks are set in a great, triumphant grin, and you know that all will be well.
Interrogation 11. Lord Inquisitor Titanida Fawkes became aware that she was not a Gretchen. At roughly the same moment she became aware that she was vomiting. Or at least, that she was trying to vomit. She had no idea when she'd last eaten. It was usually a question of days rather than hours, but her stomach was doing its best to empty itself regardless. It felt like a fist, clenching in time with the hammering inside her skull and bringing up a thin, searing mouthful of bile with each squeeze. For a time, the nausea was her universe. It was all she could do to keep herself propped up on shaking arms and keep retching, in the futile hope it would eject the memory of being Makari. When the sickness began to fade slightly, she tried opening her eyes. But the grating of the cell floor appeared to be expanding and contracting as if it were breathing, and she had the horrible sense that what she could feel through the leather of her gloves was not a grid of metal, but the horrible spongiform rigidity of fungus. Fawkes began to vomit again, and continued for a long time.
"By Mars and Terra Hendrickson," she croaked at last, when a half-opened eye revealed a normal-seeming floor. "I had no idea the shamanistic traditions of Fenris were so visceral." "Believe me when I say, Inquisitor," replied the rune priest, as she rose shakily to her feet. "You got off lightly." One look at the Death Watch veteran told her he meant it. Hendrickson looked ghastly. She had worked with psychers long enough to know the effects of overexertion, but the extent to which projecting Makari's memories had depleted him was like nothing she'd seen before. He was withered, almost, in as much as the word could ever apply to a space marine, and especially one so robustly built as Brother Hendrickson. The thin layer of fat sheathing the musculature of his torso had been burned away entirely, leaving skin hanging loose from slabs of wood-dense brawn. But his face was the worst part of it. His eyes bulged from sockets blackened with the crusted blood of the ritual, while his cheeks had drawn in to reveal the subtly inhuman construction of his skull. Usually, you only saw a glimpse of it. A flash of sharpness when he threw his head back to laugh, or when he snarled in irritation. But now there was no hiding it. Above a beard newly shot through with brittle whiteness, his lip was ridged with the roots of fangs. Fawkes stared at the face of her oldest ally and felt only a deep, atavistic fear. "I am sorry for the discomfort," he said, tilting his shaggy head towards the floor to spare her the primal unease of meeting his gaze. It has been many years since I took recourse to the old methods. I forgot what they were like to the uninitiated. It is of no consequence, said Fawkes, fighting off another wave of spasms from beneath her ribs. We witnessed something truly unique there. There was no other way we could have reached the end of the creature's tail, and—
You could have just asked,
said Makari, in accentless low Gothic.
I beg your pardon,
snapped Fawkes, tensing every muscle in her body to keep from screaming in shock.
Pardon for what?
Asked the creature, as that awful, mocking grin widened beneath its shattered nose. Fawkes just stared, and so did Hendrickson. She had no idea whether the question was sincere or whether the Gretchen was playing games, and that, more than anything else, frightened her. Between her eye for detail and Hendrickson's psychic gift, they had developed an indomitable intuition for Xenos thought over the years. They had learned to read the body language of sapient fractals, called the bluff of beasts which could only be seen beneath the lethal sunrise of a dying pulsar, and now they had been outwitted by this. Makari hopped up into the interrogation chair, lithe in spite of its shattered arm, and sat cross-legged on it like some horror from the fairy tales of ancient terror.
I'll even sit in the chair,
it crooned, in the words it just should not have known, and then slapped the metal in exasperation.
All these questions for Morksnick days, and now you got nothing to say. I can see why you're not very popular, Inquisitor Titanida.
There is nothing left to ask,
intoned Hendrickson, like a snow flurry licking the last embers of a fire into stillness, and began advancing on Makari with his knife drawn. Fawkes wanted nothing more than to be rid of the beast, but still she could not help but disagree with the rune priest. There was the matter of Biter, for one thing, and of Makari's so-called capture, and something else. Perhaps?
Of course. There is one thing,
blurted Fawkes, getting the words out just as Makari drew breath to mock them further, and Hendrickson's gaunt, sorrowful face swung round to look at her as if she were insane.
Gazkul did not die, she stated.
Nah, he did,
argued Makari, grin broadening as it tapped its clammy brow with one talon.
You just saw his head come off, remember?
But it did not last,
snarled Fawkes, too fatigued now to marshal her rage.
Know this, Xenos. There is nothing. Nothing. I would rather than there be no reason for us to speak further. But the matter of Gazkul's return was the impetus for this whole misadventure. I will admit, even to you, ventured beyond the bounds of reason in pursuit of an understanding of him, and I will be damned if I do not hear the truth of it now.
Reckon you're damned either way, cackled Makari. But I've truth if you want it, for whatever good it'll do ya.
The question loitered in the gloom of the cell, in silence broken only by the furtive rushing of Makari's breath through needle teeth. The brig was never truly silent. Whether it was the morose rattling of horns and claws along cage bars, or the susurration of prayers to the incomprehensible gods, there was always something stirring in the dark. But now, it was as if a chasm had opened up between Fawkes and Makari, and the whole of the Stygian menagerie had stopped to see whether she would step over its edge. An alert appeared on Fawkes's dataviz. There had been many alerts, dealing largely with the fallout from Biter's escape, but Fawkes had dismissed them all. By now the bridge staff were well acquainted with her style of captaincy, and had relied on their own intuition to restore the Exactor's security. But this missive was from the attendants of the ship's navigator, and one did not ignore their words lightly. Apparently, a rare clemency in the currents of the Empyrean had given them an opportunity to cut hours from the end of their voyage to the naval base at Mulciber, making transit to the system's Mandeville point within the hour. Even as she took in the report, Hendrickson's voice seeped into her skull, although it was a haggard echo of its usual self.
Do you see, Inquisitor? The ending of our journey beckons, like the great aurora. Even I will concede that for all it has cost us, this venture has offered knowledge in excess of any expectation. But let it end now. The story is not over, Brother Hendrickson. And neither, I would wager, is this creature's trickery. Look how it grins, how eager it is for you to venture further into its grasp. Come, Titanida, let us make haste to Mulciber. Let this cursed thing be the problem of the Admiralty's intelligence officers.
Fawkes sent a simple affirmation back to the navigator's suite, and she saw Hendrickson's shoulders sag with relief, even as the emotion leaked into her own mind. But it slid off her anger like water from wax as she stared into Makari's lustreless red eyes. "Now then, Makari, will you tell me the end of Gazcol's story?" she asked, folding her arms and setting her jaw in a steely smile.
Oh, it's not the end, human. Not by a long way. It's just all there is for now. Still, clever of you to guess I've got something special to show you.
"It's that relic, isn't it?" said Fawkes, nodding at the string of holy shrapnel the grot was fidgeting with. "It's connected to him somehow."
Very clever,
hissed Makari, narrowing its eyes and shifting forwards in the steel chair.
And it can show you something far more impressive than the Space Marine's trick just now. You said you wanted to know Gazcal Macurk Thraka. Well, that can happen. What's it to be then, Fawkes?
Lord Inquisitor,
barked Hendrickson in sudden alarm.
You go too far.
Yes, replied Fawkes.
You know full well the agreement we have brokered. The prisoner is to be given over to naval intelligence the moment we enter real space. The cruiser, Hammer of Eustathios, is moving to the Mandeville Point as we speak, with a boarding shuttle ready. The prisoner must be secured for transfer now. Or would you squander what goodwill you have managed to claw back with the Imperium of Man before it is even bestowed on you?
Fawkes thought for a moment, as both Makari and Hendrickson looked at her. She tried to tell herself she was weighing things up, but in truth, her mind had been made up the instant Hendrickson had protested. She could not help it. Once she was told she was going too far into the dark, Fawkes's only instinct was ever to go further.
Hendrickson, you know me too well to think I can turn my back on an opportunity like this.
Yes.
And that is why I am trying to save you from it, as I have done countless times before when your curiosity has near doomed you. Do you remember the first time you saved me? Better than you do, I imagine. And how did you find me to be then? Blind, drunk, and belligerent, as you well know, slurring something about the worst bastard Xenos of all being the ones we heap with laurels, wasn't it? And then swinging a punch at a sergeant of the Adeptus Astartes. Quite. So why didn't I die? It would have given you the easy way out you were after, for one. But what else, Hendrickson?
Hendrickson projected the sensation she had come to recognize as the psyker's interpretation of a sigh, in particular, the sigh he used when he realized that Fawkes's mind could not be changed.
I said I respected your audacity, Titanida. I said that showing such boldness, such recklessness in the face of certain death reminded me of what it was to be human. So then,
she concluded, as she peeled off one glove and walked briskly to the interrogation chair with her arm outstretched.
I hope you will be similarly reminded now, and hope you will trust my good intentions when I confess I have no plans to surrender the prisoner to the Admiralty. I suspect I have little choice in the matter at this point.
Fawkes leaned in close enough to Makari to feel the creature's hot, mildew breath on her face, close enough that it could have had its jaws round her neck in a heartbeat had it wanted her dead. Then she looked it right in the eye, smiled, and grabbed the shards of the round that created Ghazghkull Thraka.
Chapter 11. Ghazghkull dies, for a while, again.
So this is death, is it? I've had worse. I need not die. Not if I do, not will it. My enemies did not die when I took their heads, nor when I took them again. Not because they were tough, because you did not will it, because I did not will it. Now I wish for death. If I did not, I would not bear this wound. But what comes next? This thing you have shown me, it is vast. It is great, and violent, and sacred. I will have it for myself. You showed me where to carve the path, and here, in this place, is where it narrows. This thin curtain, this death, is all that stands in my way. How frail it is. I will tear it down. I will breach its gates, as I have breached every gate before me. I will tear down its walls, as I have torn down all walls. But conquest has made my body strong. Too strong now, I see. The blood clings to my veins, and will not cool fast enough. It defies me, so I snarl, and my anger finds voice where I should have none. If my blood will not cool, then it will burn, and I will go to you in flames. I am moved now, my head held up by the hand of my enemy. It regards me as it lifts my remains, and I regard it in turn. There is triumph on its face. This thing thinks it knows victory in defeating me. It thinks it knows power. But for all the plate it wears, for all that's been done to make it into a thing of war, it is vermin. I study the bones beneath its skin. I see how its body is gnarled and swollen, how its whole self has been made, in the hope it might hold on to the stars in the name of a dead god. It is a vain hope. Those stars will burn green in the end. The vermin is dying, I see, even with such mild wounds. It is like a joke, I think, as it bares its feeble tusks, like a poor copy of an orc, twisted together from the parts of a weaker beast. But you made us right the first time. Not even the Primarchs, the peak of their dead god's work, could be as perfect as the lowest part of the Great Green. The anger swells now, as the vermin holds my head up in the broken temple. And I think that I had to die today annoys me. But why could it not have been a Primarch? That fight I would have relished. I crave that fight. But I cannot have it, and it makes the embers of my anger glow white with rage. In time, it brings the thunder beneath the plating of my skull. I howl as it pounds down on me from my centre, and the world begins to come apart. This is not death. Not yet. This is worse. Lightning flashes where there is none. Shadows split into colours I have never seen before. I see corpses twist into the shape of fungus. I see the stone walls breathe. I taste acid brightness and hear the running of wild beasts in the dark. Suddenly there is bellowing and shouting in voices I cannot understand. It comes from everywhere and drowns everything. I do not know if they speak to me or if they are me speaking to someone else. I am lost in a desert with a shattered skull, and I do not know who or what I am. I am afraid, but then the voices speak at once, and I make sense of them at last. They are your voices, and when I know this I can make words of them, as I've long learned to do. I seize your mighty voices in the storm, and I listen. I hear you now, and myself returns to me. The end is near, but I do not feel weak. I feel stronger than I have ever felt, because beyond this there is something new, something terrible, something perfect. My rage does not fade, but it has become bliss now. The bliss an orc should always feel. It is a shame I did not get to fight a Primarch, but I will in time. Darkness spreads on the smashed stone below. I know it is death coming. It feels like I look down on it from up in space. From the grin of Gork itself with your eyes. I look down on my enemies rushing to the side of their boss. But they are not worthy of your gaze, so I look past them, and through the smoke and the ruin, I see a great mass of green. Orcs upon orcs upon orcs, all looking at my head held high. They fall still. They think this is the end. But I have learned this is not true, and now I must teach them. Just as you arrived with the thunder to remind me who I am when I am lost in the desert, I will remind them who they are. It is why you put me on Urk and why you led me here. The orcs had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten what they were made for. For so long, they were only existing. But orcs were made to fight, and to win, and to make slaves of all they do not kill. Under my hand they have remembered. Under me they are living. I look out over the orcs, and with the last of my strength, I break into a grin, a great snarl of triumph, like the gash you've carved across the sky, so that they know they are winning. That's all they need. If the Horde believes we're winning, we will keep winning. They will believe it because I believe it, and I believe it because you believe in me. Green fades to black, and I can barely see the orcs now, but I hear the shout that rises from their throats as they see my victory. I will see them again soon. But then, a thought comes to me. How am I to come back to the world? I remember how it was when I was lying there with my skull smashed. How I knew you would not help me until I helped myself. That is how it has always been. I carry myself and you make me stronger. But I cannot carry myself back from death. If your will is for me to return, but I am the instrument of your will, how will it be carried out? And what will happen while I am gone? Doubts gather. They are like storm clouds in the fading light. The thunder comes again, but this time you are clearing it. I squint at what I can still see of the world. There is fine bullets he has not lost, still with me after all this time. They are sawing an enemy apart with their great chain chopper. They are roaring my name, as is proper. But there nearby is Snazdaka, once warlord of the Bad Moons on Urk. They are eyeing up the Death Skull, already calculating their odds of seizing power now I am gone. I have spent this whole existence beating the heads of orcs together so that they fight in one direction. Without my will to enforce that, surely they will set on each other. Everything I have made will fall apart. Maybe, I wonder, I have not done enough. Again, I feel the edges of the thing I have come to know as fear. Gazcal, the most powerful orc there is gonna die afraid. Now it is enough. We set our eyes. Think harder. Look closer. I do as you ask. And in the last circle of the world that has not turned black, I see something I did not see before. It is something small and green. It is Makari, my pathetic banner waver, or it is their head. That is surprising. Makari is dying, but Makari always comes back. And although I would never speak this to an orc, Makari always knows the right thing to do. Vision is gone now. My thoughts grow slower. Even the anger fades. But I will die fighting, because you have asked me to put my trust in someone who is not myself. You have asked me to trust a creature you made to be unworthy of trust, and which at this moment is dead. It is the hardest battle I have ever fought. It is a battle I win, because I am Gazcal, and I never lose. But as the black begins to sink away into a much deeper green, a final doubt occurs to me. Makari always comes back, but it is me who brings them back by the granting of their name. If I am not there, who will find Makari?
Interrogation 12. Folks vomited far less this time. There was a thin trickle of blood dripping down her upper lip, and the air was rich with a stink of fungal decay. But she could convince herself the latter was mostly just Makari's odour. As much as she hated to admit it, whatever the grot had just done, or whatever had been done through the grot, she had long since become unmoored from comprehension on that front, had been a much cleaner experience than the psychic projection cast by Brother Hendrickson. The instant she thought of him, there was an almighty thump of flesh on metal, and she turned round to see the Death Watch veteran face down on the floor. Cold dread clenched her gut for a moment until she noticed he was still breathing. But in some ways, his death would have been easier to swallow. The idea of a space marine incapacitated just did not sit well in the human mind. Even to a human mind as jaded as hers, the idea of Astarte's invincibility was as dependable as gravity, an article of faith strong enough to masquerade as objective truth. But there he was, a transhuman psyker the size of a bear, unconscious on the deck, leaving folks alone with the monster, just as it had been at the start. She returned her gaze to Makari, determined not to let her terror make itself known on her face. I am still in control, she told herself, even as her data viz swarmed with alerts. Half were from the Exactor's bridge crew, who had sent the frigate's entire guard complement scrambling for the brig the second they had become aware of Hendrickson's status. The other half were from Lieutenant Garamond, the naval intelligence officer seconded to the Hammer of Eustathios. These alternated between demands for the asset and demands for an explanation of the massive psychic discharge his astropath had detected aboard the Exactor as it had exited the warp. Folks's every instinct screamed for her to flee towards the safety of the onrushing militarum squads and to offer the lieutenant custody of the prisoner at his earliest convenience. But she forced herself to belay every single militarum deployment order and did not even bother speaking to Garamond. Whatever happened next, she suspected, would put an end to his complaints one way or another, and the bridge crew could keep him occupied until then. Sighing, Folks shut down her data viz altogether, rose on creaking knees, and folded her arms as she locked eyes with Makari. The grot was still and silent on the interrogation chair, and it was not grinning for once. That battered, knobbly face radiated as much malevolence as always, but it seemed more sober now, somehow. The mask of the capering, spiteful trickster had been discarded, and beneath it sat the malign emissary of an ancient and fundamentally hostile power. That interrogation chair, now, held a faint suggestion of a throne's aspect. And yet I am still in control, Folks thought again, as if repetition might conjure belief. And to her astonishment, it worked. Folks was in control. She was not dead. The exactor remained in her hands, and Makari was still confined to its brig. What's more, she had just been inside the mind of one of mankind's greatest enemies and come out with nothing worse than a nosebleed. For once, Folks spared herself the usual fixation on everything she had not yet achieved and saw, for the very first time, just what a formidable creature she had made of herself. She had always wrestled with her purpose as an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, with her purpose as a human, really, in a universe where such a condition offered so little cause for hope. It was a struggle that had dragged her younger self into the depths of despair, and after meeting Hendrickson at the very bottom, she had spent the rest of her life trying to find the surface again. But now, eye to eye with this virulent little node of hostility, she'd found her duty at last. Whether she did it for the carcass on the throne or just for herself, she would stand in the face of whatever darkness was to come with eyes wide open. The truth would either kill her or it would leave her stronger, but either way, she would no longer let herself be burdened by fear. Folks snorted with a mix of relief and amusement at the thought. Perhaps I left a little of myself in Gazkul's mind, she wondered. Or perhaps I took a little of Gazkul with me. Cryptman had always warned her that if she gazed too long into the abyss, it would gaze back. Maybe he'd been right all along, and Folks had just been wrong to interpret his words as a warning. It was time, she felt, for another look into the abyss. "Come on then, Makari," she cajoled with a loose smile that her face had almost forgotten how to shape. "That was interesting enough, but you're holding out on the really interesting stuff. You're going to tell me how Gazkul came back from death."
Or what?
Hissed the grot, leaning forwards until its broken nose was just a hand's breadth from her face. "Try me," replied Folks, with acid-sharp sweetness narrowing the gap to a finger's width.
"Fine,"
said Makari at last, and with a slump of its shoulders, almost too small for Folks to notice, it began.
Chapter 12. Gazkul's Birth. Something touched my shoulder. Might have been a hand. But since I was surrounded by orcs all shoving each other and shouting, that weren't a surprise. It was weird how it stung where it touched me, and I had a strange feeling that meant something, but I was jostled away from it before I could work out what. I was trying to remember what errand I'd been sent here on and who was going to kill me if I didn't do it, when there was a big meaty cracking sound from somewhere in the crowd, and an orc started hollering, "It ain't working! It ain't doing anything at all! I'm saying the name, but they're just looking at me like normal zoggy grots!" "Keep trying!" shouted another orc. I couldn't see more than a dozen tusk lengths in any direction for all the jostling bodies, but I knew from the smell alone there must have been a dozen or more orcs in there in not too big a space. There was another big cracking noise, and I heard what I was dead sure was my name, even though I'd never heard it before. "Makari?" asked the orc through frustration-gritted tusks. The crowd shifted, and I saw it was Bullets. I don't know how I knew that was his name, but I did. He sounded furious and desperate, and in front of him was a grot looking down in baffled terror at the crude banner that had been shoved into its hands. Bullets hefted a huge gore-slick chunk of stone into the air and stared at the grot expectantly, and then brought it down again with a snarl of exasperation when nothing happened. Crack! "Next!" snapped Bullets, as the freshly brained grot was tossed on the pile behind him, and the banner was snatched from its hands to give to the next grot in line. "Macari?" asked Bullets, and once more nothing happened. Crack! "Next!" "Macari?" Crack! "Next!" This went on for some time. It occurred to me after a bit that I'd been set down here to fetch fresh ammo, and to zog in hurry if I didn't want my head eaten. But then the orc next to me got battered out of the way by another orc with a big metal arm, and that weird, burny, stingy thing was on my shoulder again. It was definitely a hand, I reckon now, and a big one too, clamping down proper hard. "Macari!" roared Bullets into the face of the next doomed grot, and before I knew it, I'd answered him. "Here, boss!" I shouted, loud as I could, and the big death skull's head shot round in surprise. He was so taken aback that he dropped the rock, so the grot died anyway. But nobody was looking at that. They was all looking at me, and that scared the guts out of me, because I was still trying to work out what me was. So I did what came naturally, and cowered. "Loot my sogging truck," said Bullets in an awed whisper. "It is him, isn't it? That's just how he cowers." Then he clocked a hand on my shoulder, and as his gaze worked its way up to whoever it was attached to, rage bloomed in his eyes. "Hold up," he said in a deep, deep growl. "Is that the hand of the boss you've got there?" "Yes," replied Grotsnick coldly, at the exact moment I remembered the concept of Grotsnick, and looked up over my shoulder at him. It certainly was the boss hand. It was Gazcole's, but for some reason it wasn't attached to Gazcole. It was stuck in a sort of frame, attached to a harness worn by the doc, with levers he could pull to make the fingers move. "I thought," said the doc, "that since he was out, I might as well make some improvements. And since the hand was going spare, I figured this was worth a try. You're welcome, by the way." "Ain't thanking you for nothing," barked Bullets, and I got the feeling he'd be going for the doc's throat if it weren't for the big cyborg standing to either side of him. "You will soon," said Grotsnick quietly, but Bullets ignored him and spoke to me. It's good to see you, Runt, but things ain't good. You saw what happened up in the ruins. Things are touch and go. The boss had lost a lot of blood and—" "He's dead, Bullets," interrupted Grotsnick, and as he said it, the memory of the last thing I'd seen hit me like a headbutt from the boss himself. "He can't be," hissed the lanky blue-tattooed war boss. "He'll pull through, we all know it. Now, zog off back to your cave. The boys are fighting hard up here, and we need Macari with them. They need to see the banner to know the boss is all right." "No, Bullets," said Grotsnick, still all quiet and cold. "He is not all right. We're beyond that. We do need Macari, however, but down here with me, not dodging bullets upstairs. Must we fight over it?" Next to the dock, a cyborg spun its massive drill arm menacingly. Bullets looked like it was taking every drop of his faith in the prophet to hold back from the obvious answer. But in the end, just like the boss himself had taught us all back on Urk, he managed to put the urge aside. "Fine, Grotsnick. You go until sunrise. And Macari, if he tries anything dodgy, well, he'll probably kill you first, but try to shout, yeah?" "I know what you're thinking," said Grotsnick as the door closed behind us. I'm thinking you've been busy, I muttered, as I craned my neck to look around. Just as the dock's set-up on Armageddon had been a step up from his digs in Rustbike, this was a step up from that. There was machines in there I'd never seen the likes of. Huge, great, whirling things cracking with black light, shapes made out of lasers floating about in mid-air. I ain't a mech, so I'm missing the words, but you get the picture, yeah? There was some familiar stuff too, but on a whole new scale. Wall-high banks of transfusion squigs, tubed up to vats of machine-stirred blood. A tank of what I thought was eel squigs, lit by the crackles of blue lightning down their spines. And was that? Yeah, it was only a bloody squig-off, with its head removed so it wouldn't go berserk, but its chest still rising and falling as a pair of forge bellows clanked away to keep it alive. But even the truck-sized beast was just a minor detail, really, compared with the structure in the middle of the dome. It was Gaz, or most of him anyway. The doc hadn't just taken his hand off. It looked like he decided to give the prophet a complete refit, taking him apart into more bits than I could count and mounting them on a giant, roughly orc-shaped scaffold. All of it was strung together with tubes and bunches of sparking cable, and as two of Grotznick's cyborgs started trudging around a capstan down on the work floor, all the pieces started coming together at once. At the same time, what looked like the bits of a battle wagon started sinking from the ceiling on thick clanking chains, and my eyes nearly fell out of my head. I was staring so hard. It was armour, the biggest set of armour I'd ever seen, with a claw on one side that looked like it could chop a dread in half like a squig liver sausage, and a gun on the other that made Dregmek's shooter back on Urk look like a snotling slingshot. Down it all came, and as each bit settled into place, a whole squad of grots clambered up to start welding, nailing and strapping it into place. And then, last of all, coming down from the very apex of the dome so it blocked out the lights behind it, was a great horned silhouette, the prophet's severed head. As it settled into place in the socket between those huge armoured shoulders, a whole row of floodlights slammed on around the scaffold, and Gazgal's face grimaced down at us, without so much as a spark of life in its eyes. "Changed my mind," I said to Grotznick as I gawped when I could find it in me to speak at all. "I'm thinking you're a complete zogging maniac." "The word is genius, Makari," sneered the doc, as he stalked over to the godlike corpse beneath the centre of the dome. "I'm also wondering," I said, once there was enough room in my head for suspicion, "how it was that you just happened to have all this kit set up and ready just in time for the boss to die. I know you're a vile git, Grotznick, but cried the doc, turning round with a cruel grin and raising a finger. "That's what I knew you were thinking. That all of this must have been my plan somehow. Is that right? That I set all of this up and lured Gazco into his death so I could resurrect him as my personal puppet?" "Yeah," I said, because in fairness, that's exactly what I just thought. "Well, forget it," said Grotznick. "I might have found out about Gazco's plans by sneaky means. I do spend a lot of time in his brain, after all, and I might have set up certain contingencies down here in case the duel with Ragnar went poorly for the prophet. But was all this a scheme? No, Makari, I'm just an opportunist, is all." "Don't trust you," I snarled. "I'd hope you wouldn't," said Grotznick, grinning even wider. "But don't you think, if this had all been my doing, I'd at least be gloating about it?" "Fair," I said, as he paced over to what looked like a generator out of a stomper covered in fungal growth and started flicking primer switches. "Look, Makari," said Grotznick, as he frowned in concentration at a spinning dial. "If you're still convinced I'm up to no good here, consider this. You probably hate me more than any orc alive, correct? Yeah, I hissed with some enthusiasm. Good, said the doc. It will be odd if you didn't. But now consider this. If that is the case, then why, Makari, would I have interrupted the work of a lifetime to go and correct those morons outside their boneheaded attempt to bring you back? Even if I had, do you really think I'd be so stupid as to then order you into my lab where, runty and pathetic as you are, you'd at least have a fighting chance of doing me in? Well, you did do that, I said, cackling at the thought. I did do that, he admitted, but because I had a zogging good reason. I needed you here, Makari. Or I suppose the gods needed you here. The boss needed you. You've got plenty of grots to fetch and carry for you, I said, gesturing at the creatures working away on the scaffold. Why go to the bother of getting your least favourite grot sicked out of the great green for the job? Grotsnick growled then, but it was the sort of growl an orc makes when he's knackered from thinking too much, rather than a threat. Because as mad as it sounds, Makari, I think you were the only creature who really knew Gazkal. I've spent years trying to get closer than you, and yet I never managed. It's 'cause you spent all that time causing him pain, I hissed, bunching my fists into pathetic little nodules of meat. I always served the boss and the gods. You just wanted to drive him mental and make him into some giant freak to do your bidding. Or just amuse you. Said Grotsnick calmly, picking a bit of rotten meat from between his tusks as he nodded. You don't deny it, then, I said, not sure what to make of that. Nah, said Grotsnick. I thought it was obvious, really. I just like experimenting on things and hurting them. He stretched then, and his shoulder, which had grown hunched from all the time he'd spent bent over Gazskull's skull, made a sick-sounding cracking noise. But I was serving the gods in my own way. What? By driving the greatest orc alive mad for a laugh? Come off it, Grotsnick. All that time with Gazskull, he scorned, shaking his long, cruel face in disapproval. And you never worked out that his strength sprang entirely from his madness. Did you not see how as I worked deeper and deeper into his skull, the gods spoke ever louder? And how the louder they spoke, the greater Gazskull's feats became? Makari, Gazskull's pain was his power. I hated how much that made sense, and as I looked up at that great dead mountainside of a face above us, I realised it was as true as anything can be. If that's true, I said, as Grotsnick hauled down a big lever and the generator came to life with a shriek of captured lightning, then what do you need me for? Because I think you helped him live with the pain, said Grotsnick. It was almost a whisper, like he suspected the bosses outside might overhear him somehow. I hate you, Grot. You hate me. But why do you think we, as a species, paint black and white check marks over everything we get our hands on? 'Cause they look really killy, I ventured, knowing it was the right answer. For the same reason we've got two gods, wretch, spat Grotsnick. Contrast. The great green is one thing, but to make the whole, I suppose you could say it takes all sorts. And Gazkal is what Gazkal is today, or rather what he was until fighting Ragnar anyway, because of the both of us. Yeah, I said, unbunching my fists but crossing my arms so he still knew I didn't trust him. Yeah. Who do you think installed the bionic eye on Drekmek that meant he missed every shot he fired at Gazcal back in Rustspike, just for example? Like it or not, Grot, and you won't like it, I've been just as much as a part of the God's plan as you have, all these years, and it's just as painful for me to swallow. But you're still just as much as a part of it as I am, in whatever they've got planned next. What's that, then? I asked. No idea, said Grotznick with a grunt, as he dragged an enormous cable from the generator to the scaffold where the Prophet had been reassembled and heaved it into a socket as thick as his whole body. At least in the long run. But I know right now it involves you coming over here and helping me pull this really, really big lever so the boss can come back and figure out the rest. If only it'd just been the lever. But Grotznick never ever sets anything out straight. That lever, that old massive generator in fact, weren't for bringing Gazcal back to life at all. That was just what the doc needed to make a zap big enough to jump-start the real machinery he'd set up for the job. Of course, he only told me this once it was already switched on and couldn't be stopped, which was when he also told me that there was a 4 in 5 chance the process would fail, blowing us, the Prophet, and half the planet into bits that'd make dust look big. So, that was relaxing. The main generator, the doc said, was in space, but it was also sort of in another dimension because of how unstable it was. Like I said before, I ain't a mech, so you'll have to figure it out for yourself. The main thing was it was going to shoot loads and loads of electricity down from a hole in the sky right into the Prophet's bonds, and we had just a few minutes. Grotznick didn't know how long exactly, of course, to get him ready. Climbing up onto the boss's shoulder plates, I bullied the doc's grots into winching a great big hose into Gazgal's mouth, then cranking open his jaw with a truck jack so I could get it by his tusks. I nodded down at Grotznick, who stood by the headless squig, and with an expression that was pure nasty glee, he switched on the hydraulic press above it. Don't know how to describe the sound of all the air in a squig's lungs being forced through a hose by an industrial crusher, along with most of the lungs as well, but I'm sure you can imagine. Grotznick started shouting then about critical alignment or something, and a big siren started going off, nearly deafening us both. Apparently there'd been a plan for that tank of squiggles I'd seen earlier, but since the generator was about to fire, there wasn't time for nothing clever anymore. So Grotznick bust open a hatch in the side of the boss's armour right over his guts and just upended the whole tank into it, water and all. I'll tell you now, I bet every tooth I have that he did that for no reason but his own amusement. But with that done, and with the last rivets clamped into place, sealing the armour that would hold the boss together until his own body could finish the job, there was nothing left to do but wait to see if we'd be blown into the great green ourselves. The siren was getting really annoying by then, so Grotznick shot it, and in the silence after I looked at him, and he looked at me. I wondered if maybe we'd found some common ground after the rush to get the Prophet's body ready for his return. But no, that one shared look told us that we both hated each other's guts as much as ever. We was grods, I suppose. Anyway, that was when a beam of light, like the searing hot piss of Gork himself, came smashing through the roof with a noise so loud it wasn't a noise, and everything went green. There was no way of telling whether the machine had worked, or whether we'd blown up the world and ended up in the Great Green. Well, no way of telling until this next bit happened, anyway. Chapter 13. The Prophet Lives.
It begins in white. I am cold. The wind howls. I am beneath the ground. I wonder, did I fail you? Have you sent me back to have another go and get it right this time? Will I rip the tongue from the beast you send and walk through the storm again? Will I have my brains torn out again, so that all that remains is the sound of your voices? Must I do it all again, I wonder? I will if I need to. But then I smell hot metal and burnt flesh. I did not smell this the first time. I feel my skin. It is burning, sloughing through my flesh inside a shell of forged hot iron. This is good. I feel the ground quake, and I think it is the impact of your mighty green foot, until the boom comes again and again. It is the beat of my heart, and it thunders. Blood surges through into my limbs, carrying with it the ecstasy of your violence. It spills from gashes and rivet holes and quenches my seared flesh in clouds of steam. I feel life in my bones again, deep and green and wrathful as your divine spores spread their tendrils. Your voices deafen me beneath the metal that binds my skull, but where it was once agony, now there is only bliss. It is more than my head can hold, though, and so with my first breath I throw my head back and I roar your war cry for all the galaxy to hear. I feel cool air on my face and immensity above me. I stand with a grinding of fresh-joined bones, and I hear steel scream and bolts crack as I free myself. Finally, the sight of my one eye begins to return, and I bare my fangs in joy, because I realise now why you have chosen vision as the last of these gifts. The sun is beginning to rise over the shattered city of my enemies, and I stand in a crater at its heart. Dawn is coming, but above me the night is still wild and black and infinite. The stars shine fierce, laid out for me to plunder, and every one of them shines green. It is the first thing I have ever found to be funny, and so, with my second breath, I laugh.
Interrogation 13. Folks didn't know when Makari's tale-telling had segued into a full-fledged psychic projection, but as the reality of the cell surfaced again, through the violent immensity of Gazkul's rebirth, she found herself reflecting on something the Grot had said earlier. Speech is just another way of hitting people with your brain. She had not realized just how literally Makari had been speaking. But to her horror, it soon became clear that the vision had not entirely ended. She was back in the cell, certainly. But the light was flickering now, strobing over the needle-toothed creature that watched her, and in the guttering dimness between each burst of light, she swore she saw that the walls were coated in thick, glistening fungus. But worse than that, Gazkul was still laughing. Folks had heard a lot of things over the years that would have reduced stern men and women to madness. But this was the worst sound she had ever endured. And now it was no longer inside her head, but crashing through the steel of the brig. It was clear just how inhuman it was. It was absurd, indeed, even to call it a laugh, so profoundly alien was the joy it embodied.
You wanted to get to know Gazkul, didn't you, Lord Folks?
Said Makari, in a whisper that dripped with venomous relish.
Well, now's your chance, 'cause he's coming.
The floor shook as something far too large to be human stepped forward in the darkness behind her. Deep, cold terror lanced from the plate on the back of Folks's skull, and as another great footstep fell, she steeled herself to turn one last time and face the dark. But there was no need, because this was her monster. Brother Hendrickson stalked past her in the guttering light, vast, gnarled, and wearing only the clots of his own gore. He was something that belonged more in a tale told to frightened children on some frigid feral world than in the confines of a void ship, and if it weren't for the relief Folks felt at his appearance, she would have been terrified of him. His bolt pistol remained in his holster. The old wolf was beyond such things now, in a place of fangs and claws. Makari, meanwhile, seemed unconcerned as its death approached. The Xenos seemed radiant with anticipation, if anything, basking in the brutal laughter that still shook the cell as if it offered the protection of a Titan's void shield. It offered far greater succour, Folks supposed. For what even was death to Makari when it stood in Gazkul's psychic shadow? When that febrile green body was torn apart, whatever was inside it would simply sink back into that laugh and find its way back to its master. Folks blazed at once, with the certainty that she could not allow that to happen. "No, brother," she said, as the beast that had been Hendrickson towered over Makari. It was not the command of a lord of the Inquisition, but the quiet appeal of a damaged old woman to her only friend. She just prayed to the throne with all the faith left in her that Hendrickson was still there to hear her. The Fenrisian turned his head, and Folks found herself looking into the eyes of an animal. There was a reason beyond loyalty, of course, that the ancient rune priest had stayed with her through all these years, even as the orbit of her ambitions had swung ever further into the gloom of heresy. Hendrickson's pride had never allowed them to speak openly about it, but he, too, had been drifting further from the Emperor's light over those long years of duty. And as those wild eyes flicked over her, with thick drool looping from the yellowed fangs below them, it was clear how far into the dark he had sailed. Each son of Fenris must fight a battle, Hendrickson had told her once, from the day they take the Wolfen Cup and are reborn as a son of Russ. It was a curse of sorts, written, with cruel elegance, in the very same genetic script as their Primarch's blessing. Once Folks had come to know Brother Hendrickson, she had understood at last why the Space Wolves lived with such bombastic, rambunctious vigour. They hoped that if the fires of their feast halls burned bright enough, the night might be warded off. But Hendrickson's fire had been burning low for a long time, and the wolf had been waiting at his door. Now it stood inside the threshold looking out at her. Folks swallowed hard, trying to focus past the thunderous malice of Gazkul's laughter and the wicked glee on Makari's face as the Gretchen watched them fall apart. She had never had much of a faculty for basic conversation, let alone speeches, but it was time for her attempt at a beating of the mind of her own. "This is what he expects, brother," she spoke aloud in her mind as she looked at those predators' eyes and hoped someone was still listening behind them.
"You were right, of course. This was all a ploy in giving us Makari. Gazkul meant only to spread his own legend, while that bastard Blood Axe helped himself to whatever information he plundered before running. Gazkul was counting on us to act to type. Small-minded, frightened, and incapable of conceiving any solution but extermination to Xenos problems. He was certain we'd be good Imperial citizens and send his damned familiar back to him in a fit of zealous butchery.
"So?" barked Hendrickson at last, from somewhere in the depths of his winter, and Folks fought to hold back the surge of hope that threatened to spring from the fact he had responded at all. The fact that Makari's grin was now wavering, as the silent communication stretched between his captors didn't make it any easier.
"So," she said, "will you prove Gazkul right, brother? If there's something to be learned from this rotten imp's tale, it's just how much Gazkul gained by acting against type. He has redefined our understanding of the Orcish mind and what it is capable of, and we shall slaughter him just the same. Ragnar tried that, brother."
Hendrickson snarled, mentally, and in the confines of the cell, but Folks continued undaunted.
In Gazkul's defiance of his instinct, he learned what orcs were always meant to be, and if we defy ours, perhaps, old friend, we'll learn to be human again.
For just the briefest instant, the wolf in Hendrickson's eyes was gone. And that bright young boy from before the Wolfen Cup, to whom the Adeptus Astartes were just the bright, distant servants of an unknowable god, looked out. Folks had never seen Hendrickson look so fragile. She had never seen him look so strong.
"Let us put an end to this problem," said Hendrickson out loud,
and Makari virtually wriggled with glee as his blood-black timber of an arm swung out to grab it by the throat. But Makari could not see the faint, weary smile that had found the corner of Hendrickson's mouth when he glanced back at Folks. Rather than crushing Makari's neck, the rune priest dragged it by it, walking it briskly out of the cell and down the adjoining corridor of containment units. Folks worked a crick from her neck and followed him. As they proceeded into the brig's depths, she risked a glance at her dataviz. The demands from Lieutenant Garamond had come to an abrupt halt, she noted, but then a flood of backlogged alerts began pouring across her vision, and she saw why. The hammer of Eustathios, along with every single naval vessel in dock at Mulciber, had been called to the system's edge. Where an armada of catastrophic size had just emerged from the warp, Fleet Command was in uproar. The ships, now arriving, had somehow shrouded their numbers as they had encroached through the warp and had transmitted the Mulciber Yard's up-to-date passcodes ahead of them. It had been assumed there'd been a casualty of the Munitorum's record-keeping, some undocumented fragment of a battle group inbound for resupply. But of course, they were orc vessels. Folks's heart jumped as she realized where they had almost certainly acquired the passcodes. Throne knew how they'd retrieved Biter from an escape pod adrift in the warp, but it barely mattered in the end. There were thousands of ships in system already, with a second wave of emergencies already beginning, and Mulciber would have struggled to repel them even with a year to prepare, let alone a few hours. And at the Armada's heart, Folks saw now as she scrolled through frantic pics taken by outer system sentries was a behemoth of a vessel. It was easily 3 times the mass of the largest ship in the defence, and it was purpose-built rather than coaxed into function from the wreckage of a non-orc voidcraft. But what really gave it away was the banner, 3 miles high, that projected from its dorsal ridge like a sail-rigged mast. It bore the image of an orc with many arms stood atop carnage, the image of Gazkul Thraka, whose laughter still boomed through the brig. But as Hendrickson came to a halt at one of the corridor's empty cells and yanked open its foot-thick door, that laughter began to falter. The lights strung along the ceiling stopped flickering, clearing the shadows of any illusion. And as he held Makari up to behold his new home, padded and fitted with a partial stasis field to make absolutely certain its occupant could come to no accidental harm, the laughter stopped entirely.
"No!"
wailed Makari, all composure falling from its face abruptly as it realized what was happening.
"No!"
The grisly little monster bit and clawed at Hendrickson's forearm, but might as well have been fighting against gravity. With a contemptuous snarl, the old wolf hurled the grot into the cell and slammed the door with a leaden thud. "Gazkul has come," he remarked, after a moment spent reviewing his own dataviz.
"Good,"
said Folks. "He shall be just in time to see us leave, bearing his most valuable possession, I have already instructed the ship's navigator to execute our departure.
Where shall we go?
We'll have time to figure that out en route, said Fawkes, and Hendrickson grunted his assent. Fine, but first we eat. Fawkes would have smiled, relieved to see such firm proof that her companion had held on to himself. But something was wrong. Makari had been shrieking in rage all the while they had been talking, though the sound had been almost comical, muffled by the cell's door, so it sounded like the whining of an insect. Now, however, while the grot's high-pitched screeches continued, they were underscored by something deeper. It was a roar, and the lights began to flicker once more. It grew louder and louder until it began to shake the deck itself. Fawkes felt as if some vast carnivore was thundering towards her, jaws splayed, and one glance at Hendrickson told her that he felt it too. The bellow rose to a crescendo of abject fury until the air itself began to shimmer with its force. The lights along the corridor sparked and then burst one by one, plunging the corridor into darkness. And the darkness was green.